Hello, this is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service, with reports and analysis from across the world. The latest news 7 days a week. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
This is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Danny Cox, and at 13 hours GMT on Thursday the 17th of May, these are our main stories. The World Health Organization says it's taking decisive action to halt the spread of Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo after the latest outbreak reached an urban area. The world's biggest shipping company, Maersk, says it will shut down its operations in Iran because of the US decision to reimpose sanctions. It's been confirmed that Meghan Markle's father will not attend the wedding between his daughter and Prince Harry in England on Saturday. Also in this podcast, experiments in waste matter reveal why fish are dying in Kenya.
This is due to hippos living in the water, and they poop in the river, and then that contributes to water quality problems for the fish.
More details later. The World Health Organization has warned of a potentially explosive increase in the number of Ebola cases in the Democratic Republic of Congo after the disease spread from a rural area to the city of Mbandaka. The WHO is preparing to distribute an experimental vaccine which needs to be stored at extremely low temperatures, which will be a major challenge in areas with an unreliable electricity supply. 23 people are known to have died in the current outbreak. Dr. Peter Salama is Deputy Director General for Emergency Preparedness at the World Health Organization in Geneva. Paul Hawkins asked him how serious is the fact that the virus has crossed into a city.
This is a major development in the outbreak. We have been anticipating, given the close relationship between the city of Bikoro and Mbandaka, that we would face risks for Mbandaka to become infected. And indeed, now we have confirmation overnight that we have urban Ebola, which is a very different animal from rural Ebola.
Tell us why it's a different animal.
It's very different because the potential for an explosive increase in cases is now there. We have more than 1 million inhabitants in Mbandaka. Mbandaka also happens to be on the banks of the Congo River. The Congo River connects to several surrounding countries, including Congo-Brazzaville and also to Central African Republic. And through tributaries, it connects to major cities such as Kinshasa. So this puts a whole different lens on this outbreak and gives us increased urgency to move very quickly into Mbandaka and stop this new foci of transmission.
Well, what do we know about the one case in the city so far? Do we know anything about who it is, where they've come from, where they picked it up?
Yeah, we know that 2 or 3 people attended a funeral in Bikoro, which has been one of the major foci up until now of the epidemic. And then they travelled after the funeral. Presumably the deceased was infected, and then they went to Mbandaka. So they've had contact with a likely case.
Right. And what measures are you taking in the city?
So we've already established, preparing for this eventuality, isolation and rudimentary case management facilities in Mbandaka. We will now prioritise for the upcoming vaccination program Mbandaka before anywhere else, because, as I said, this is the big risk now to an explosive outbreak.
So we're looking at a mass vaccination program for the city ASAP.
Yeah, it's not a mass vaccination program in the sense of what your listeners would be used to,
right,
with vaccinating everyone over a geographical area. This is highly targeted. You take a case and you take every contact of that case, and then you plot the contacts of those contacts, and it's very targeted to that group that's most at risk.
And what about international travel restrictions, quarantine measures, that kind of thing, or is it too soon for that?
So we're not recommending at this point any additional travel and trade restrictions on Congo, but we do know that around 13 countries are already beefing up their entry and exit screening, and we know that DRC itself is also beefing up its exit screening.
Any advice for anyone listening in Mbandaka? How worried should they be, and how confident are you of containing the outbreak?
Well, the good news is that the population of DRC is very used to Ebola outbreaks, and they know what to do, which is to protect themselves by avoiding mass gatherings, mass funerals. They know as well that traditional healers can amplify the response, the outbreak. And they know as well that for once we have some very optimistic news in the sense that we have a vaccination that works, that's already in DRC and will be made available to those most at risk.
Dr. Peter Salama from the World Health Organization. Well, I spoke to our Africa health correspondent Anne Soy and asked her for more on the outbreak.
Relatively speaking, it's not that big. However, the concerns are that it has now gone to a densely populated area, and there are real fears that it could spread and become bigger than it usually is. This is the 9th outbreak that the Democratic Republic of Congo is dealing with, and so it has relatively some experience dealing with Ebola and bringing it under control before it spreads too far. But the fact that we had a very serious outbreak in Africa a few years ago has everyone concerned about such outbreaks.
How big is Mbandaka, and what are the fears if it does reach the city?
Well, it is a city of at least 1.2 million people. It is a transportation hub. And because of that, the fact that people can travel is a real concern because, it takes some time to incubate once Ebola has infected a person. And therefore, it is not possible to detect very early on. And that is the real concern here, that it could spread potentially even to other countries.
Anne Soy. Officials in Afghanistan say fighting has resumed in the western city of Farah, a day after the government said it had repulsed an assault by Taliban militants. There are reports of intense clashes, and Barasan Etirajan has more details.
The attacks began overnight. First, 3 suicide bombers detonated explosives close to government buildings in Farah city. Other militants then launched several attacks on the security forces. Local officials said some of the insurgents had been hiding in civilian houses after they were beaten back on Wednesday. US-led forces have carried out airstrikes in support of the Afghan military. A local official said more than 1,000 insurgents had been involved in the first assault, which started on Monday night.
And Barasan Etirajan. The world's largest container shipping company, A.P. Moller-Maersk, says it will shut its business in Iran following the US withdrawal from the international nuclear deal. Alan Johnston has more details.
The Danish firm A.P. Moller-Maersk is in the business of moving container cargo of all kinds around the world. It's a vast operation at the heart of global trade. But the firm's boss said that with the reintroduction of American sanctions, it wasn't possible to do business both in Iran and in the US. The French energy giant Total has already indicated that it may abandon a multi-billion-dollar Iranian gas project. The announcements have cast doubt on whether European leaders, who want to save the nuclear accord, can safeguard trade with Iran.
Alan Johnston. It's been almost a year since a huge fire engulfed a high-rise residential building in London in the middle of the night, trapping people sleeping inside and killing 71 in what was described as Britain's worst fire in modern history. The scale of the Grenfell Tower tragedy shone a spotlight on the use of unsafe construction materials used in housing for London's most underprivileged residents. In the case of Grenfell, much of the blame was laid on the combustible cladding on the outside of the tower, which helped it to spread quickly. Today, a much-awaited final report on the causes of the fire last June was published. We'll hear from the person who compiled that report in a moment. But first, one of the victims of the fire is the former Grenfell resident, Shaheen Sadafi. He is chair of the survivors group, Grenfell United.
It's been a hard year for all of us, but for me, what is amazing about Grenfell United is that we are all survivors and bereaved, and we are dealing with so much personally. But we are coming together to fight for change. We've lost our homes and our loved ones. We can't get them back, but we are determined to make sure that no one else has to suffer what we have suffered. The report is so important to us. When we met Dame Judith, we looked her in the eye and we asked her, amongst other things, to ban dangerous cladding. Today we want her to look us in the eye and tell us that these dangerous materials will never be used again. What keeps us awake at night is knowing that there are schools, hospitals and homes that have this cladding on them.
The senior engineer who was asked by the government to investigate building safety in the wake of the fire is Dame Judith Hackett. Dan Damon asked her what her task had been.
It was to look at the regulatory system that exists here in England and to look at how that system had allowed the failures which resulted in not just the appalling tragedy at Grenfell Tower, but the subsequent discovery of a number of other buildings with poor cladding systems on them. How had that happened, given that we had a regulatory system in place that ought to have not allowed that?
Even though this is a London story, people around the world know about it because of the dramatic pictures, because of the terrible loss of life. And they, I suppose, will know that something caught fire, a fridge probably, and then the fire went up inside this kind of chimney created by this flammable cladding.
Mm-hmm.
As far as it goes, there were rules that should have stopped that happening. Why didn't the rules work?
What I have found since I have looked at the system is that there is a lack of clarity. The guidance that exists around all of this is horribly confusing and inconsistent. There is a lack of regulatory enforcement, so people can get away with things. The level of prescription that exists in the guidance gets used by the industry to game the system. And what I mean by that is if the guidance doesn't say you can't do it, then they assume that it can be, which is an example of where they don't take responsibility and don't think for themselves what I believe they have a moral obligation to do, which is to build safe buildings for people to live in. I have been astounded at the lack of responsibility and the lack of care for the people who will use and live in those buildings that I've seen demonstrated by those who ought to be taking that responsibility. The new regulatory regime I'm putting in place will ensure that those people do take that responsibility and that they're held to account by a better regulatory system than we have now, with proper enforcement and proper sanctions.
You've already come in for some criticism because what you've not done is ban that inflammable cladding completely. You haven't said it should never be used. Why not?
I've read the regulations. I've read the guidance. It's already very clear that to clad a high-rise building, you should only use materials of limited combustibility or materials that have been fully tested. Anyone who's tried to fully test a system containing combustible materials, as far as I'm aware, has not got through that test process. So given that that's already in place, how did we end up with materials on buildings that didn't meet either of those specifications? There must be other problems in the system.
And what you've already said is that there isn't the follow-up. There aren't people who can enforce the regulations. Is that, in effect, a resources problem, a budget problem? There isn't the funding for people to go round and check, just basic building control.
It's partly a resources problem. It's partly a competence problem. All of those resources are there. Some of them are not listened to. Some of them are not used when they should be.
This is an international problem, actually. You've examples of other places where this kind of inflammable cladding or the wrong kind of building techniques has led to tragedy.
Absolutely. I've looked at both the incidents that have happened around the world and also at the regulatory systems that exist elsewhere in the world.
Give us some examples.
I read a report back in February that came from Australia. If you had taken the word Australia out of that report and substituted England, everything that was said about the Australian system is applicable to us too. So there is clearly a need for us to share what we're finding and continuing to learn from others.
Dame Judith Hackett talking to Dan Damon. Next to Kenya, where new laws to stop cutting down forests have hit the poorest hardest. The new legislation means a bag of charcoal now costs 4 times more than it did 3 weeks ago. Then it was $15. The BBC's Mercy Juma has more.
I am in Enzio Forest in Kitui County, Eastern Kenya. Beautiful scenery, fresh air. I can spot several flowers. I can even hear birds chirping. But something else catches my eyes. Tens of tree stumps left behind after trees have been cut. I can see a stump of a huge acacia tree and another of a tamarind tree. These are all indigenous trees. Across the Enzio River, smoke billows from a man-made kiln oven where someone is burning charcoal. There are hundreds of similar kilns in this forest. No one here regulates the felling of trees, and thousands of people have been competing to cut the best mature ones. All this changed a few weeks ago when the central government banned logging in all public forests, and the Kitui County government, which has been a major producer of charcoal for export, banned this commodity from being traded outside its borders. Benjamin Mukulo is the county's Director of Environment.
If you go down into the wards towards the northern end of this county, you will definitely see how much trees have been cleared. These charcoal burners have cut trees which are as old as even 100 years. They have cut them from the bottom, and they don't care what happens to the tree after that.
But some people are clearly defying the ban. I'm at the local police station, and Mukulo shows me tens of sacks of charcoal impounded just days ago. There are also several luxury cars whose seats have been removed, creating a hollow space to transport charcoal illegally. John Kiruru is a resident here. He says that while many support the ban, charcoal production is the only business locals know, and many will struggle to make a living and support their families.
Because of poverty, locals like myself sell the trees to outsiders for them to cut. There are many trees here, but now they're not there. A 25 feet tall tree goes for about $180, and one that's 20 feet tall is around $100 or $120.
The recent logging ban has also pushed charcoal prices to an all-time high, hitting the budgets of poor households that use this commodity for cooking. In the capital, Nairobi, Hawa, a mother of 4, is preparing breakfast for her family. In one go, she pours all the contents of a tiny charcoal bag into her stove. This cost her about $1. 4 weeks ago, she could get twice the amount of charcoal for the same price.
We have a lot of problems now because charcoal prices have gone really high. Those who can afford to buy gas are okay, but for the poor like me, we really need charcoal. Some days my children have slept hungry because I cannot afford kerosene either.
But while the government said it expected this to happen, it insists that in the end the ban will be more beneficial and long-lasting.
Mercy Juma in Kenya. Coming up,
we're learning more about these incredible animals, the largest fish in the sea. They're gentle giants, if you like. They're filter feeders.
So why are whale sharks flocking to Madagascar? Burundians have been voting in a controversial referendum that could allow President Pierre Nkurunziza to stay in office until 2034. Local media has spoken of a high turnout, but there's little independent monitoring, and most international observers have chosen not to take part. The president came to power in 2005. Paul Hawkins heard more from the BBC's Prim Dikamagenge, who's outside a polling station.
I am at a polling station in the neighborhood of Gagara, north of the capital, Bujumbura. Where I'm standing, I can see 9 queues of up to 30 meters each. So people really came quite early to cast their ballots here.
And this is a really, really significant referendum, isn't it? Because potentially it would mean the current president could stay in power until the year 2034.
Yeah, exactly. Potentially that's correct because the new constitution will allow to extend the presidential term from 5 to 7 years, and the president can serve 2 terms. So potentially the current president, who is already serving 3 terms of 5 years each, could stand again for another 2 terms. But so far he hasn't indicated whether he will be standing again. But so many people here believe that he cannot be doing everything he can to change the constitution for somebody else.
Give us some background to this referendum in terms of campaigning.
Well, the campaign has been marred, some violence, especially against opposition parties, those who have been campaigning for a no to the changes of the constitution. There have been also a massacre in the west of Burundi, where 26 people were killed. So, but overall, given the very tense situation in Burundi that has been there since the 2015 crisis, the campaign hasn't been that violent as people would have feared.
Prim Dikamagenge in Burundi. Next to a photography exhibition here in London with some of the best pictures from around the world, including those that document social change in Africa. The exhibition is called Photo London. Richard Hamilton has been finding out more.
I'm standing in front of a self-portrait of a young man from the Himba people of Namibia, and he's wearing what looks like a traditional African outfit, but if you look at it more closely, it's got a Lacoste symbol, and he's also wearing a modern Western sort of gilet. So I'm with the photographer Kyle Weeks. What were you trying to do in this project?
This particular project was born out of myself becoming aware of the sort of misrepresentation of the Himba culture as a whole. I became aware of this rift between the representation and the actualities of these people's reality, particularly the fact that the young men in general are not really photographed much at all. That must probably be as a result of this hybridized fashion sense and the fact that that doesn't really play into the stereotypical view of this culture in general.
And why did you decide that you wouldn't take the photo but you'd let the subject? We can see in his hand he's squeezing the remote control that leads to the camera. Why did you decide to do that?
I tried to narrow the gap between myself and the people that I was photographing by introducing the idea of self-portraits, and so giving them almost complete control over how they wanted to be seen, so as to create a heightened sense of relation between myself and the subject.
So we've come to another photograph, which is of a young Congolese woman reclining on a couch, and she's surrounded by traditional tapestries and cloths, and she's covered in a type of vegetable paste which makes her skin look extremely orange, and it's a slightly surreal image. I'm with the photographer Patrick Willock, who was born in the DR Congo, or Zaire as it was. What made you want to photograph these women?
Well, I came across this motherhood ritual about 5 years ago, which is called Wale, and it's a ritual which is linked to the birth of your first child. It's a rite of passage where basically those young women learn how to be a mother, and they are celebrated for having given life. And she's probably one of the last one. And she's here lying down on this couch together with her mom. Her mom was a Wale. A Fallon that you see here, the baby, will probably not be a Wale because the ritual is probably not going to survive that long. A lot of rites of passage have disappeared in Africa and in DRC specifically. And what I wanted to do in this picture, which is actually inspired from Gauguin, was actually to give back all the beauty and all the grandeur of this ritual, because in the eyes of the community, those women are queens. Traditionally, the ritual imposes various taboos on those women, and they are in semi-recluse seclusion during a couple of years. Today, unfortunately, those women are stuck beyond those 2 years, sometimes 3, 4, or even 5 years.
So how long did it take you to prepare this image? Do you have to set up all the cloth and the couch and get her to pose in the right way?
Yeah, well, some images take a couple of days to put together, others take 3 weeks. But at the end of the day, it takes a lot of time to build trust and relationship with those communities, and that takes months, if not years. The village of Walibotungu is actually called Ikoko. It's in the middle of the territory of Bikoro, and there is unfortunately currently now an Ebola outbreak. And I obviously feel a lot for them, because this is where I go, where I work. I know those villages, and I hope that they will all come out safely from this terrible situation. I hear that the World Health Organization is actually sending this new batch of vaccines to try to save the situation.
Richard Hamilton with that report at the Photo London exhibition. It's been announced that the father of Meghan Markle will not attend the wedding between his daughter and Prince Harry in England on Saturday. In a statement, Ms Markle said she hoped he could be given the space he needed to focus on his health. Thomas Markle is reported to have suffered heart problems. He had been expected to walk his daughter down the aisle. Meanwhile, a rehearsal took place in Windsor this morning of the carriage procession that the newly married couple will take part in after the ceremony. Our royal correspondent Johnny Diamond watched the proceedings.
Under a flawless blue sky and in glorious spring sunshine, the rehearsal for the big day began. A military band and a march past by those who will line the route, and then out of the gates of Windsor Castle, the travelling escort of the household cavalry, and front and behind one of the carriages that might be used on the day. The streets around the castle lined by onlookers.
This balloon is for Meghan's dad, because we've just heard he's not at all well. He's having an operation on his heart. So everybody in Wales sends him our best regards.
An hour before the rehearsal, a statement came from the bride. Her father, she said, will not be coming to the wedding. The BBC understands that she has spoken to her father and that he is too unwell to attend. She thanked those who had offered support and asked for her father to be given the space he needed to recover. There's no word yet as to who will walk Miss Markle to the altar.
That's Johnny Diamond in Windsor. Researchers have discovered that whale sharks are flocking to Madagascar. I asked our science correspondent Helen Briggs where the creatures were coming from.
That's a very good question. So we're learning more about these incredible animals, the largest fish in the sea. They're gentle giants, if you like. They're filter feeders. There's been sporadic sightings of these huge fish around the coast of Madagascar, but no one's known exactly how many there are or how they're related to other populations in the area. So it turns out that there are more than people thought hiding in plain sight, if you like. They counted 85 of them from the spots on their backs, and they seem to be a separate population from in neighbouring areas. So they can see where they swim. Some of them swim down to the south of Madagascar, and there's another smaller population that congregates around there. And then they head off west. Where they go eventually, we don't quite know. We know these ones are juveniles. They're not as big as they can grow. They can grow the size of a bus, and these are slightly smaller. It seems that they're drawn there to feed, but there's no adults there, so it's not a breeding ground. So there's still many mysteries surrounding these ocean giants, but the more that we know about them, the more we can do in terms of conservation.
So what's the pull of Madagascar?
There's incredible marine diversity off the island. Now, it's known for its wildlife, for its lemurs, these incredible animals that developed in isolation on this island, but also it has incredible marine diversity off its coast, coral, sea turtles, whales, and these whale sharks. So it seems that there are these areas of richness that attract all of these big marine giants. They're coming to feed the shoals of fish. And I spoke to one of the scientists who's done the work, and so they're actually counting how many individuals. There are 85 they found off Madagascar, which is actually quite a big population for these things. And you can tell them apart by the spots on their back. So she's incredibly excited. She can actually tell them apart now just from looking at their spots. They're all different, apparently, and really hopes that this will lead to greater prominence for these fish and greater protection in the long run. There's nothing specific that's protecting them around Madagascar. There are some marine areas that are conserved. So the aim in the long term is to get better protection for them.
Who's done the research and how did they do it?
Well, it's done by the Madagascar Whale Shark Project in Madagascar. They went out on boats and they surveyed whale sharks and they took pictures of them. These are all uploaded to a database. They can look at the pictures and work out how many individuals there are. And they also put little tags on them. So you can swim up to the fish and put little tags on them. And that then gives you lots of important information about where they're travelling. There's a lot of work in this area. Other scientists are tagging tiger sharks and things like that to find out where they're travelling in the oceans, where their habitat is, but also as the oceans are warming, that's likely to affect the range of sharks. So that's important information for the future.
Helen Briggs. Fish have been mysteriously dying in the Mara River, which runs through the Masai Mara Game Reserve in Kenya, and scientists now think they've found the rather unexpected reason why. Dr. Emma Rossi, freshwater ecologist at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies in New York, carried out the research.
Members of our team noticed that when we were by the river and it rained occasionally, you would get fish that would die, and we were trying to understand why that would be. And what we found is that this is due to hippos living in the water, and they poop in the river, and then that contributes to water quality problems for the fish. We think this is a natural phenomenon that we're just now understanding with our scientific research, and that actually it was probably much more widespread. There used to be hippos in much of Africa south of the Sahara Desert, and so they were in a lot of places where they are no longer. And so this research that we did in the Masai Mara, where there are healthy populations of hippos, shows us what might have happened in many more rivers throughout Africa before. So on a daily basis, about 8,500 kilograms are being added to the river of hippo poop. And when the water is low, when it's not raining, the hippos congregate in these pools and they poop and they hang out in the water, and then at night they feed on the grass. And then sometimes when it rains, a lot of rain flushes that water from those hippo pools downstream and causes oxygen in the river to drop, and that can kill fish.
Dr. Emma Rossi, freshwater ecologist at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies in New York. And that's all from us for now, but there'll be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Danny Cox. Until next time, goodbye.